I can only say thank you all of you, for making the time to come. I know there are tons of things you could be doing with your time now, especially we have Her Royal Highness here making time to come and listen to this, and I'm really honored. Thank you for coming. Thanks to the jury, they are here. They made this possible. I don't know what they saw, but here I am. And I thank you all. And there are lots of people behind this. Klaus and Turi came over to UBC to do the film that you see tomorrow. And thank you for your friendship and kindness. And so on and so forth. I have Christina and Linda, lots of people who have been working to make this day and week possible, and I thank you so much. So today we're going to talk about the ocean, our global ocean. And I got this title from Henrik, Fair Sharing of the Global Ocean, and I thought it was really a good title, and it's connected to climate change, subsidies, fisheries subsidies, and large-scale protection of the global ocean. I like this because really it touches on some of the reasons why I'm working with the oceans and fisheries. It's actually, at the end of the day, it's about the people and what it means in terms of all the values we get from the ocean and how to preserve and sustain this into the future, not only for us, but for future generations too, right? We all like eating fish, most of us do. And our children, grandchildren would like to do that. So how do we do it? Now, this is the outline I put together for this. So I start off by talking a bit about fairness. What is it? What is that when you talk about fairness? And why is fair sharing of the global ocean critically important for the world? Fair sharing of the ocean as it relates to climate change, as climate change is happening. Most of us believe this. There are a few people who don't, but okay, that's all right. Then fisheries subsidies is a policy issue, right? We have governments, we have management, we have governance to help us deal with issues. So fisheries subsidies is a tool, public tool that you can use to help society achieve a goal. And the question is, how are we using that in terms of fisheries and oceans and the sustainability of this? And how does it relate to people at the end of the day? The large-scale protection here, we're talking about marine protected areas. We're talking about marine reserves, that is those areas that are fully protected from fishing or other activities. And then you have all sorts of levels of protection. How do they relate to sustainability and also to people and their livelihoods? And then I'll have some concluding remarks. So let's get going. What is fairness? I'm sure everyone in this room has heard this. Somebody say, it is not fair. I think if you go to a primary school in almost everywhere, you see kids doing that. It is not fair. What is that? But it's something that human beings yearn for, fairness. And it starts very early. Generally, we judge fairness in a relative way, usually in comparison with our peers or groups or something from where you are versus where you can be, right? How fair is that? And true fairness will be where everyone has the same thing or the same possibilities, the same functions. But we all know that having the same for all is virtually impossible. We're people after all. So another way to interpret fairness is that you have a system, an equitable system of balance, such as where those who work harder get more than those who don't, right? So you structure the system such that you can compare something and make sure that those who work harder versus those who don't, and so on and so forth. And you've heard about the golden rule, I think most people have. Essentially, fairness is about you do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? I'm quoting from the Bible here, right? And I think this is not only about the Bible or Christianity. Every major religion has something of this nature, whether it's Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, or other big religions. So you have this there. All right? Then this inequity among the world's population is a serious issue. I think most of us believe. You've heard about the 1% issue. And how does that play when it comes to the ocean? especially with respect to climate change, fisheries subsidies, and protection of the ocean. This is important. I get a quote here for you. Inequity is one of the most enduring practical problems of human societies. This is a historical thing, and it's been a struggle. You want people to be equal, but it's tough to do it. Some work hard, some don't, some are here, some are there. But it's still an issue, and we need to tackle that. And I think it's becoming more and more issue for all sorts of reasons. Then inequality has grave economic, so you're not talking about this just because you have a good heart or kind heart. It has real consequences. It has grave economic, political, and social consequences. And I've been around the world, and I see it around the world. That's why I like coming to Scandinavia. I spent 7 years in Norway pursuing my graduate studies. I learned a lot, really. Some of the best things I learned is when I was in Scandinavia about how you really treat each other as a nation or as a group, right? How you care about fairness and sharing and making sure that every member of the community attains some level of fairness, if you like, or livelihood. So there are consequences. If we don't take care of this, it can explode. And you see countries where this has happened, right? If a few people take everything, you're likely to get social and economic troubles. Now, distribution of resources, now we get closer to the ocean and to fish. Distribution of resources has implications for social welfare and governance. Yeah, that is what I was alluding to. When I was in Norway, they would tell me, you know, in Norway we realize that those of us who can and are willing to work hard should, in their own interest, take care of those who are not able to some degree, so that you get the peace and space to really contribute much. You see the thinking here. So there are connections between fairness and economic development and poverty, and these are also connected to the distribution, how you distribute resources, the health and safety of people. And to get it close to our world today, I think the way we treat fairness as it relates to natural resources and the environment will actually also dictate how successful we end up being achieving the global sustainable goals of the United Nations, which all nations of the world that I know of have signed on to. So you can't just achieve all of them, whether it's taking away hunger, reducing poverty, making sure life in the ocean is sustainable. All those things have connection to the distribution and fairness in how we do it. Now, getting more specific to our oceans, why should we care about fair sharing or sharing things fairly? I've been saying that the ocean is actually our lives, and this is a very quick list of things. I could spend a whole day, and you don't have the time to actually talk about. But very quickly, 60% of the world's population lives within 60 kilometers of the coast, and this is increasing. In fact, predictions is that in 2 decades, there will be 75% of the world's population massing along the coast, whilst we have sea level rise coming and all the other stresses on the marine environment. 50% of our oxygen, you probably all have heard this, comes from the ocean. In fact, this is where I got the idea of saying the ocean is our lives, because every second breath you take is created or made in the ocean. So without the ocean, you will have half a life. And what is half a life? Think about that. What is half a person? There's no concept. So the ocean is our lives. It is crucial for balancing the environment, and that's what the science tells us. A lot of things that happen, absorbing carbon, for example. A lot of the carbon we emit is absorbed by the ocean, which is good in the first instance, but that also leads to issues as we go. Most people think of the ocean, they think of marine and the fish. Provides a lot of food for many people. Just to give you some numbers, we take annually, legally and illegally, about 120 million tons of fish out of the ocean each year. 120 million tons of fish. That's a lot of animal protein. To make you really capture what this means, if you convert this to mature cows, a mature cow on average is 1 ton. So you have 120 million mature fish cows, I joke about that, coming out of the ocean year in year. That's more than all the cows we slaughter on our farms globally. So, and there are huge food security consequences, obviously. Many parts of the world, fish will be the only animal protein they take in West Africa, Southeast Asia. And in the rich parts of the world, if you have a good day, what do? You go to the restaurant to have a nice meal, seafood, right? And so it's good for rich, and it's very important for the survival of the poor. We need to keep this going. Recreational values, cultural values. I had a student who studied spiritual values of the ocean to people in British Columbia. You go to in summer, you go to any of the beaches in Vancouver, and I'm sure it will be in almost all coastal big cities, you see people, and you see the value of this. It's huge. Jobs, jobs and jobs and jobs. And I talk about jobs very sentimentally, and incomes and livelihoods of people. And according to our estimates, about 260 million people derive some income from fishing. 260 million people. And when you look deep into the data, most of the jobs are in large developing countries. You have India, China, Indonesia, all the way to Nigeria. And to me, this is the biggest service we get from our oceans and the fisheries they produce. Because these people who are in these countries, many of them will have nothing to do if not for the fish. And you can all imagine the social and economic stress this will cause, not only in these countries, but to the whole world. Last year, I had the privilege of talking at our Oceans Conference in Washington at the State Department. And I was a bit excited because Obama talked 2 hours before I came on board to talk, using the same podium, so I was kind of floating in a way. so and I said, when most of you, and this is in the US, right? Lots of them are Americans, were surprised how quickly Obama became gray when he became president, right? Everybody's shocked. I said, if not for fish, if not for these jobs, not only Obama, but everybody, all of us in this room will be grayer than we are now, right? Yeah, because this is trouble if these guys don't have jobs, right? Then somebody came to me and said, but you will never get gray. I will never get gray. No, I get gray. You don't see it, So this is really an important point. I take this quite seriously. Now, I've talked about all the good things it does to us, but the oceans are also under threat. And these threats have different consequences on different parts of the world, different regions of the world, different people, So the cumulative total impact is a problem. But the distribution of these impacts is even a bigger issue if you look deeper. And this is where the fairness comes. Whether it is overfishing, fishing down the marine food web, taking all the big fish, or taking smaller and smaller fish as we go. Some predict we may end up with only jellyfish or even mud at the way we are going. What are the consequences of that to people whose only animal protein is fish, right? That's an issue. Then you talk about pollution. Plastic is in the news as it should, right? What does it mean when, as being predicted in the future, we may have more plastic than fish in the ocean? What does it mean for people's survival, health, and security? And oil spills. You can just keep naming all the stresses that we're putting on the ocean. And there are a lot, and we need to deal with them. Now, so that is the intro. Now we get to the three components of this, and climate change and fairness is the next one. The earth is warming, and the surface of the water is warming. The oceans are warming. The average temperature you see here, the more red it is, the more the average is over the long-term average of the temperature in the ocean. And you have less ice. People close to the poles know this. Ice is melting in the Arctic. And the ocean is becoming more acidic, which is another scary thing. less oxygen in parts of the ocean, deoxygenation. That can go on much longer, sea level rise. And all of these are happening to the biophysics of the ocean. I'm an economist, but I work a lot in an interdisciplinary setting. So I've kind of come to learn some of these things. Now, so the physics and the chemistry of the ocean is changing. What does it mean? If your environment is changing, the animals that live there will have to change. So productivity of the fish we see is changing. So they struggle if the oxygen is less, then you struggle to get oxygen to survive rather than to build your body. So you have a smaller body mass overall, for example. And the distribution of fish is changing. Fish are moving away to the poles, from the equator, from the tropics. You know, fish are like people. If it's too hot, what do? We put on the air conditioner, or we open the window if you don't have an air conditioner. If it's too cold, you put on the heater. The fish cannot do that. They don't have that benefit. So what do? They move and follow the temperature. And those who cannot or cannot do it fast enough, what happens? They perish, right? So there is the effect on the chemistry and the physics. There is the effect on the animals in the ocean. And when I hear my biologists and scientists talking about it, I say, come on, there has to be an effect on the economics, on the social, on the food security, right? It's obvious. And this is what you see here in the paper we published in 2011, where we took all that has happened to the physics and the chemistry. We say if you feed them into the biology, there's going to be effect on organisms, on communities of organisms, on populations, and so on. And then at the end, it's going to hit people. It's going to hit the fisheries. We're going to have changes in the catch. We're going to have changes in the revenues and even the cost of fishing. You may be lucky the fish may come to you and jump into your boat. Who knows? But you may have to search further to find it, right? So the cost can be affected, and then the profitability, the income to people. So you have all sorts of impacts that can come from this. And this is not theory. This is happening in a number of places around the world. So physics, chemistry changes, ecology changes, people, livelihoods, and conditions change. Now, we do a lot of modeling. I'm not going to bore you with the modeling, but I will show some of the results. This is Vicky Lam, my former PhD student. She's now a postdoc. This is part of her thesis work. And what we did there was to build a global model and estimate the impact of climate change on fisheries revenues as the total money we take globally. And that leads to all the social and economic thing. First, the catch and the total revenue. And this is what you see. Now, remember, our key part of the title of this talk is fairness, or the fair sharing of the ocean. What this picture is telling you is that most of the changes you are going to see is going to be around the equator, in the tropics. The fish is going to move away. So how fair is that, right? They move away to the poles. And this kind of, that's the average numbers you see here, and now we come into this theme again and again. So what does this mean? That West Africa is going to lose its fish because of climate change, right? Southeast Asia and the Pacific Island states, right? This is the part of the world where food is needed most, as you would imagine. So we did some conversion of this very quickly into the protein changes, and this is what you see. Again, the middle of the globe, if you like, close to the equator, is going to see losses in fish. And this should be scary to any policymaker. And the global citizens should be saying, so what is this? Fish is moving to Canada, to Russia. In Canada, I don't think we need more fish. Just look here. So this is not where the fish should be. It should be in the places where people really need food, but the fish is going. What are the consequences of this? Big stuff. So here, just to give you more data, this is another part of Vicky's PhD. And what we did was to model West Africa and see what the consequences are likely to be with climate change. You see all over there big losses in catch, all over, and that will then translate to all the other things that we care about. So this is a two-scenario thing. If you have low greenhouse gas emission, you have those green circles, and then if you have high, you have the red one, and mostly the bigger the emissions, the more the impact. And in the case of Nigeria, for example, 52% loss in the catch. This is a country that's already big deficit in fish consumption, and it just goes all over the place. And the thing about this, and I'll get to that, is that if you look at these developing countries in the tropics, they emit much lower per capita CO2 or greenhouse gases, okay? They depend more on fish than the rich parts of the world, and they are going to be hit more. And I think this is the message you need to have in your mind. Not the cause of most of the problem, the ones to suffer the most, and the ones who depend on this the most. So if you are thinking of sustainable development goals, this should wake you up, really. Now, so on average, negative 8% with low bet, about 26% on its high emissions for the whole of West Africa. Now, here we have some numbers for you. This is revenue for Pacific Island states, and they are big in terms of climate change for all sorts of reasons. Sea level rise, for example, what would it mean to these small countries? But this just tells you the potential revenue losses for these small island, Pacific Island states under the high emission scenario. And the red line there is actually the global average. So globally, we estimate a drop of about 10% in the revenues from fisheries under climate change. But for these countries, way more than 10%. And that is the distribution. What is the fairness? How does this work out? We did some modeling. So this is not only between countries, it's also within countries. This is a modeling exercise we did for Mexico under two scenarios again. And you see the red areas are areas that will lose fish. The blue areas are those that are predicted will gain fish under different scenarios of climate change. The yellow is somewhere washout, almost zero. So the question is, are the people living in this big red area, are they just going to move to the blue areas to fish? What does it mean? Even if they are allowed institutionally, which I don't think is easy, to move from one fishing village to another, 100 kilometers away is not something easy. But even if it is possible, what is the cost of this to them and so on? What is the food implications of that? For this section, this is my last slide, and I've thought. So here what we did is to put on these two axes, you have on the y-axis, percentage change in the maximum revenue potential from your fisheries if you're a country. And on the y-axis is the Human Development Index as an indicator of the economic development of a country. And you see right there in the corner where people are actually poor and very vulnerable, therefore, are those who are sitting here with negative impacts of climate change, right? Togo, my God, Togo, they're struggling. They can't buy medicine for kids, and they're going to be hit, and so on and so on. And then you see Iceland. They're smiling, huh? They're smiling, yeah. And then you have the rest of them. So this HDI is an indicator also of economic development. The GDP is part of that index. And what we know is that the emission of CO2 almost goes one by one with economic development. So these countries are those that emit the less overall, and they get hit the most. And to me, that's a moral and ethical question that the world needs to deal with in terms of fairness as we're being hit by climate change. Now we move on to fisheries subsidies and fairness. And essentially, fisheries subsidies are your money, taxpayers' money, that is being given to the fishing sector. And I have to say this, it's not only the fishing sector. It goes to agriculture and other sectors, so we have to be fair to the fishing sector. But it does go there. And there are consequences of this, and it's well documented in the literature. So in our group, this is a theory. I don't know how many of you like graphs or have economics background. Essentially, when you have this our basic model, it explains a lot. It's very simple. You have the amount of fishing effort you take out, and the money you make, the cost of fishing. Sorry, I'm doing this to you, but this is the linear, and this is the cost, the total cost of fishing, and this is the revenue. And usually people stop fishing here when they don't make money, according to the theory. But if you don't have subsidies, this is the extra effort you will take out. If you have subsidies, you actually move further. You go out and fish more because your balance of cost and revenue moves, right? So your cost. So if you pay fuel for people to fish, they'll fish more. This is the fundamental reason many of us don't like at least certain types of subsidies. And so the question we decided to address is to build databases, do analysis. This started around 2000, actually. Our first paper appeared in 2002, where we tried to do this. So these are some of the questions we addressed, type of subsidies, because I have to also say that subsidies are not all bad. The basis of subsidies in economics is what we call externality. So when I do my activity, say I'm producing things, right? And what I do impacts other people in society, but I don't take that into account because I'm just looking at my bottom line. Then there is an externality. Usually this is negative, but it can also be positive. But as you know, if you do a positive externality to somebody, they never complain. Yeah, if you do something that people gain from you and you don't charge them, we like that, don't we? That's almost like paying zero for something, a price of zero. But if it affects people, you will hear back. That's the bad subsidy. The problem we have is, as I will show as we go in, so this is the beneficial. Some subsidies can be good if they help you to manage your resources sustainably, like management cost, for example. But there are harmful subsidies, like fuel, that will let you fish more. And there are some that don't easily fall into these two categories. So we go out, collect data by country, globally, to try to see where these things are and what they mean. I talk about creating the living database. I've talked about that. And I just show you. So we had, before this exercise, we had estimates for each country of the world of their good, bad subsidies. But then I got one of my PhD students, Anna Schobauer, this is her work. What we then did was to take the national numbers and estimate how much of it goes to small scale versus large scale, okay? We kind of, because when I talk about this, I had a big argument with the Speaker of the House of Assembly of Indonesia. When I gave a talk and he was there and I talked to him, he said, Rashid, we will continue to give subsidies. I said, why, sir? Why? He said, we want to help our poor, our small scale. Since then, I wanted to do this study, and I got to do it with Anna. So we took the data nationally and developed a method and then decided how much actually goes to small scale and how much large scale. This is quite powerful stuff. So first of all, this is the national data, about $35 billion. 60% of them roughly are bad subsidies. Those that lead to overfishing. And a lot of the subsidies, of course, is given by developed countries where the resources are, which has its own fairness issues there, right? But the thing I really want to show you is this graph from Anna's thesis. So from her split, the $35 billion, nearly 30% of it goes to what is described at large scale. Only about 6 billion goes to small scale. So the money goes to the big guys. You're not giving it to the poor and this has lots of consequences. Not only that, if you look at the small scale component, about 40% is considered capacity enhancing. Quite a bit of it, almost half, is good actually, right? Doesn't lead to overfishing. Look at here, 60%. because the big boats, they need all the fuel subsidies and so on. So not only very little goes to the small scale, most of what goes to the large scale is actually harmful. So this work has given us another reason not to like subsidies. It's not good for the fish and biodiversity, but it's also not good for the people we should care most about, the most vulnerable, right? And that is a powerful additional argument for fairness. So we do some little calculations here. If you look at the capacity enhancing here, a fisher in the developed world gets this, whilst a fisher in the developing world gets that. So I gave a talk at the African Union. I say, you guys, you should be jump on top of the roof telling the world to take away the harmful subsidies because you cannot compete, in the market. And it makes them unviable and has consequences for poverty, for lots of things, even gender issues, right? And so on. The small-scale sector has more women active in than the big, large boats. Okay, very quickly. You shouldn't get tired. So we're getting to the third part, and large protection and fairness. And here, there's a long list of things, but I'm going to stress on the first one. Many of us economists like protection because of the insurance value of protection, okay? You have all sorts of reasons. In general, when you have a portfolio, which is what our ocean is, it's a portfolio, you want to protect part of it. That is why you don't put all your money in the stocks of Google, for example, or Amazon, or even Volvo, right? Has a big reputation here, but you don't do it because you never know tomorrow. You buy some government bonds to protect you. So you can see the protection you give as part of your management portfolio of the ocean. There are many other things. Now, to our issue of equity, we think that actually the closing the high seas to fishing can actually help with equity issues. Why? I'll tell you soon. So this is our global ocean, right? The dark blue areas are what are called the high seas. The light blue are 200 nautical miles from the coast of a country, all right? So as I always like to say, these are human-made boundaries. The fish don't know this. Fish move where they go. They don't even need visa. Yeah, I was in Washington and giving a talk. I said, you know what? Mexican fish, they just go. They go. Yeah. Even a wall can't stop them, So that's the kind of thing. So we have to think of this as a global system that needs to be managed holistically, because if you do your best in the Baltic, if Sweden does their best and other countries don't, you don't go anywhere. So you have to think about this. So what happens in the high seas can have impact on what happens in your country waters. And that is what motivated us. So looking at the statistics, 2/3 of the global ocean is the high seas. As you can see, the blue was all over. So that is point number one. And it delivers less than 10% of the total global catch. This is what motivated me to think about closing the high seas. There's less fish in there, they're sparsely distributed, they're far away, you have to bend carbon to get to catch the fish. It's costly, and why do you do this? Mostly it's because of subsidies, actually. Otherwise, they won't be able to do it. And we also check to see how much of our fish do we catch in the high seas, the catch of the global catch, how much of the species live only in the high seas. Because if we close the high seas and there's a lot of them that live there, then they won't be available for us to catch until they come over. It turned out very little, less than 2% of the world's fish live all their lives in the high seas, what we call the orphans of the ocean, because there's nobody to protect them, right? And so that gave, again, another impetus for this study. Then, when you look at it, 10 of the large fishing nations take about 70% of all the revenues. Think about fairness. The high seas is supposed to be owned by all of us. Only 10 countries take 70%. So if you close the high seas, the idea we have is the fish will get peace there, they grow, they move, they have eggs and larvae that move, and small countries like Palau, let me just pick one, or Guinea-Bissau, will have the opportunity to catch the fish when they come in. So that is another fairness issue. So this is the statistics I told you. 78% 72% of all our catch comes from fish that live both in the high seas and in country EEZs. And they will be available to you if we close the high seas. And the little thing is the one that those that live in the high seas alone. So we came up with this paper saying that we should probably close up the high seas. It turned out that we're not the only one thinking about that. Cristero and co were also doing modeling, and they came out with the same kind of conclusion. And this is the whole thinking conceptually. So you have the high sea and the EEZ. You have our boundary, you close the high seas, and the fish get some peace. They grow and increase, and you know, fish are like people. If it is too dense, what do? You move away. They jump into your boat for free, right? Yeah, that's an extreme, but that is the whole idea behind this concept, yeah. And the big part of the paper, our paper, was actually looking at the equity. So we calculated the Gini coefficient. I don't know how many people have heard about this. It's an economic index that is used to calculate the distribution of income in, say, a country. So if you have perfect equality in a country, this curve here becomes that line. So the area under this curve is 0. That's you have perfect. 1% of the population get 1% of the income. 10% get 10. 90% get 90. There's no country like that in the world, okay? Now, if one person in a country takes the whole income, you get a triangle, and the area is 1. So one person takes all the income in a country. There's no country like that. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. Now, when you make these calculations for the revenue we make from the high seas, currently, this is what you get. That's pretty close. That's 60.66 or 66%. That's the coefficient. And then, but if you close the high seas, this really drops by 100% actually to 0.33, depending on how you look at it. It's either 100% or 50%. So by closing the high seas, you also help the distribution of revenues among countries. Do you know the country with the least, the most equal distribution of income in the world? Huh? No? Can you guess? I think it's Sweden. I agree with you, sir. It's Sweden, right? So you guys should be proud, Your Royal Highness. Yeah. You know, the Prime Minister is not here, but this is quite good, the population. Sweden has the lowest. How about the country with the highest inequality? So, who is that person? Have you heard me? This guy. Okay, you know this. South Africa, for the history of the place, right? So by closing the high seas, we turn the distribution of income from that of South Africa with all the history of apartheid to that of Sweden. How will you like that? I think it will be beautiful. So that is one big argument about closing the high seas. And what else do I have? Concluding remarks, so we can start talking, hearing other colleagues talk. So fair sharing of the global ocean is critical for the long-term social and economic stability of the world because of all the benefits we get, because of all the people who depend on this, especially in the developing world where we need a lot of progress in order to lift people from the vigorous, the pain of poverty. And climate change, as we have shown, those who produce less carbon face the most constituted, are the most dependent on ocean food. And so we need to mitigate, we need to adapt. And that is a full topics for another fisheries subsidies. I think if you really want to make progress, we have to stop or convert the overfishing subsidies. There's this beautiful idea from Europe, actually. They say, maybe we should pay the fishers to fish for plastic rather than for fish. Isn't that nice? That's a good way to use public money. So the fish get a break, the ocean get a break, the fishers have their livelihood, and I call it win-win-win, actually. So that's the kind of thinking we need in order to stop this. And inequality, we shouldn't use public funds to aggravate it. The capable are already capable. Why do you want to help them? I don't think you should. I mean, they already, yeah. I should say this here. I wouldn't say it in Washington now. I'll be in trouble. Large-scale protection, closing the high seas to fishing has the potential to reduce inequality while boosting biodiversity and economic well-being. And finally, I just want to thank you very much for your attention, and to many of my students, postdoc. Henrik, I'm sorry you didn't make it here, but yeah, we have you in mind. And most of them have graduated, and of course I couldn't get everybody on the page, but these are the people. I like to say that without these people there's no professor, okay? These are the engine. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I go back.
Just wait for Thank you so much, Rashid. A really inspiring talk and really helping us understand some of the really big challenges we're in for and will increasingly be in for, it seems. But also, in my mind, one of the really big ideas that is up to par to the challenges. So really helping us think a bit more creatively about the kinds of solutions that we can use to address these challenges. I wanted to ask you one question before we sit down, and maybe we'll have time to get one question for the audience. Do you have a microphone we can run with, maybe? But just to begin with, Rashid, you mentioned Washington twice and President Obama as well. And of course, a lot of things have happened in the US since then. But can you tell us a little bit about Senator John Kerry and the kind of interest and actual political traction you got around this idea? I think everyone will be really interested to hear about that.
Yeah. You know, in the talk I gave at the State Department, I actually said John Kerry and of course Obama are our heroes and global leaders, because they've been pushing a lot of things that are not just looking at the narrow interests of the US, but linking it to the whole world, because really we need that. And so I consider him a hero, and he has been pushing a lot on the oceans. And one thing he did which really impressed me is the idea of getting the State Department to think about the oceans as a State Department issue. You know, that the US national security is also dependent on how well we sustain our oceans. And he managed to do that and got other foreign ministers to actually team up and join in order to have our Oceans Conference. And he actually mentioned closing the high seas in the last one last year. He said maybe that is what we need to do in order not only to meet the UN 10%, but even more, but to protect our oceans. So he's kind of reasonably sold on this idea already. He just sees some merit to it. And this is the kind of people certainly we need to push crazy ideas like this to higher level. People thought I was crazy, okay? But, you know, as an academic, you have to be crazy at least once in your lifetime. Come on. Yeah.
It's great. That's really good. I mean, those are the kinds of allies you really need to get these things going and to make them be more than just an academic thinking, but actually start thinking actively of how can it then be done.
Fantastic, yeah. Thank you.
Great. Excellent.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we'll take one question now. We'll have more time for questions towards the second part, but yes, there's a question here. If you can please, there's a microphone here, if you can please state your name first.
I would like to ask a question about how to safeguard from the dangers from the nuclear power around the ocean. Thank you for your lecture.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome. Yeah. So how to save the ocean and the animals from nuclear? Yeah, this is a big question. You know, when the big tsunami, and actually the Japan incident really got me thinking a lot. And I haven't touched on that, this idea of multiple stresses happening on oceans, not only oceans, but all our systems. So you had the earthquake in Japan. I don't know which one came first. Earthquake, tsunami, or tsunami, earthquake, and then the nuclear meltdown. So you have three things happening almost at the same time. And in a way, the world is a bit lucky it happened in Japan. If it happened in a country in West Africa, they may just go forever, right? So Japan is capable of dealing with this, but even Japan had big problems. I understand there was a plan to actually move all the people from Tokyo when they didn't know the extent of this. Do you know how many people live in Tokyo? That's the population of Canada, right? You know, what does that mean? And then when it happened, I got phone calls in Vancouver saying, oh, is this nuclear thing coming to our coast, the US and so on. The thing is, I'm not an expert in that area, and that's not something I've spent a lot of time thinking. But I know it's an issue. In fact, some have told me a lot of military activities actually do pollute the ocean, but you cannot even mention them, right? But,
Great. Thank you so much. Please, a hand for Rashid, and we'll come back to all these issues. Thank you so much. You can please keep that on. You can keep that on, I think. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. Now, please, Maria von Berlekom from Sida will tell you a little bit about some of the activities that Sweden has been engaged in to address these issues. Please.
Okay, so while we are finding the right PowerPoint, Nej, det sista. Yeah. Okay, so to start with, I would just like to think that I'm very honored to have been invited to this panel. I'm actually a bit nervous because becoming after Rashid, it's like, you know, when you have a 7-course menu and then you have these sort of tasters in between. I feel like one of those tasters in between. But I'll try and do this a little bit as a reflection of what we heard from Rashid and also from my horizon, seeing what's happening. I'm working at the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency. So it means I'm not sort of the Swedish government per se, but I'll reflect a little bit of what's done from Sweden in general, but also what we are doing now at Sida. So a little bit of outlook and a little bit of sort of in-look to what we are doing at home, so to speak. So these pictures, they are all from the big SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 14 conference that was held in New York in June this year, that really put a lot of focus on the opportunities and not least the challenges related to the oceans. And I don't think I need to dwell on why oceans matters, because we had a very comprehensive presentation by you, Rashid. I just want to conclude again from my perspective as representing Sida, that of course, I mean, when we work with the oceans, when we work with the marine issues, it's very much from a people focus. So what you're saying now from a scientific point of view, that it's about fairness, it's about addressing inequalities, looking at the political economy, if you like. It really fits very well with our thinking because, of course, I mean, I've seen firsthand, I've been living in Tanzania, I've been living in Kenya, I've seen that it's, of course, the local fisher communities, the men and women along the coast that get affected. It's, of course, I've been living in Vietnam as well, it's, of course, the coastal communities, again, that take the brunt of the burden when hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons become much more frequent and much more intense. So I think all this point that Rashid, that you've been making about the inequalities, the unfairness, about who both gets access to the resources, but also get subjected to the problems, shows that this is really a core development issue. We are, of course, affected in the north, but it's the people and the countries in the south that really pays the highest price. Another reflection also, I find it interesting in talking about fairness and inequality to note that even IMF these days, International Monetary Fund, actually have gotten onto this issue of equity and inequality, and also how that actually contributes to, or the opposite, to stability and fiscal balance in the country. So, you know, I think we are all on to something here. And also to just then reiterate that when we work from the Sida side, of course, it's about poverty alleviation, it's about the rights-based approach. So very much looking at this from the lens of, you know, who is affected, who benefits, and who loses. again, to recap, I'm sure that most of you have already seen this one way or another. But just to sort of, remind ourselves that as a global community, all countries have made commitments to address the marine challenges. And we did that 2015 by all countries agreeing to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I've just highlighted them because I think they do pick up basically on all issues that you raised, Rashid. So we have about reducing marine pollution and the plastics issue, sustainably managed marine and coastal ecosystem, very much for resilience, this insurance issue, addressing ocean acidification, overfishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, conserving coastal and marine areas. The fishery subsidies is specifically mentioned. Looking at blue economy in the lens of the small island development states and the least developed countries and what it means from different perspective. Special attention to small-scale artisanal fishers. Science and technology as a means and spearheading that, and also strengthening and working through the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas. So I think we do, in many ways, actually have a global framework that, in a very comprehensive ways, have contributed to giving us a shared agenda and a platform to start addressing these issues in a systematic manner. To do that, I think, again, that the SDG 14 conference in New York and also all the preceding meetings and those that have taken place after that and all the ongoing work shows that, of course, we all need to join forces. We need to have strong global framework. And I think, for example, addressing about who has access to the common seas, it's definitely a common issue. Addressing climate change is, of course, another such issue. Other issues are more regional, about shared resources along a coast, and others are national. But we need to have these global framework in place. We need basically to have the UN to address this. At the same time, and that's why I put this other one, of course, we need also not to lose track that it's about the actual people who are concerned. So we need to ensure that they also have a say, that they are involved, that they can participate, and that we not just talk on behalf of them, but that they also are involved, just as countries need to be involved. And thirdly, I would also like to mention that we have a strong potential, many opportunities in the private sector that is in many ways actually driving agendas, whether it's about this slide is actually in relation to the new plastic economy, where a number of companies have joined together to look at the issue of how they can minimize or recycle plastics so that we make sure that there is less going to the oceans. So all these actors are needed. We all need to sort of work together, while at the same time, I think, acknowledging these fundamental underlying inequalities, that it is actually an asymmetrical power balance between who has the power, who hasn't, who has the money, and who hasn't. Then looking at the conference, and what the conference did, it was, for me, it was a fantastic thing to be there. We were hosting this from Sweden together with Fiji in New York. It was really vibrant, lots of side events, lots of energy, lots of commitments being made. And some of the outcome included that, in general, there was a call for action that highlighted actually all those issues that you've been raising, Rashid. So it was sort of confirming the SDG 14 commitments and then taking them one step forward. Secondly, a very, very important outcome of the conference was, and it was very much built around that, was to actually elicit voluntary commitment. Okay, we have the talk, we have the framework, what then? So in more than 1,400 voluntary commitments were made before and during the conference. And they could be from government, most of them. It could be from the private sector. It could be from non-governmental organizations and so on. And they all, of course, provide a wealth of actual undertakings in all these different areas, whether it's about addressing climate change or sustainable fisheries or plastics in the oceans. And those commitments will, of course, then form the basis for the follow-up of the result by 2020. So it's not just something that happens out there, it's something that we can all be held responsible against. Sweden in total made around 20 commitments, some of them national, about improving our own network of marine protected areas, for example, many of them international. They fall in the area of marine pollution, blue economy, oceans and climate and so on. So they sort of cover the width of this broad agenda. Then I think, I'm going to give you a few examples, and to me, what we need to do actually falls in the areas of, it's perhaps a little bit short, but 6 C's. A C as the letter C. No, well, also 6 C's, of course, but that wasn't as funny as I intended it to be. So the first 3 are, what we need to general, of course, is to ensure that there is capacity being built. So part of this asymmetrical power relation is also that capacity is not evenly distributed. And as a development cooperation agency, as a developed country, we have a very important role in supporting and building from the national, local level and up to the regional level, capacity among partner countries, be it local communities, be it national fishery agencies, be it national protected areas, be it regional organizations like the African Union and so on. So build capacity so that people, countries, entities can take the development in their own hand. The second one I think is very, very important, is that goes more to the Swedish agenda, but that we need to be coherent. We can't say one thing in one fora and act in a different way in another fora. And I think it's very encouraging, for example, that now we are looking at how we can support actors working on the fishery subsidy issue, but also that we actually try to have also coherent position in the World Trade Organization negotiation, so that we from Sweden talk with the same tongue on all these different areas. So coherence. And of course, again, build capacity so that countries themselves also can have that same coherence. The third part, or the third C, is also to connect. Okay, so we've seen how these different issues relate to each other. In the same time, also actors relate to another, and we have to make those connections between the levels, between the actors, and between the issues. And that takes me actually to the final 3 C's. And I think, again, I mean, what this very clearly shows is that we have to work across scale. I've been talking about these levels. So we have to sort of think local, national, regional, and global at the same time and see how the interconnection goes for the different issues. Some issues are by nature more global, like climate change. Some are perhaps more local, to start with, like pollution and litter, but they turn into regional or global problem. And we have to understand those connections and how these different levels works. As I said, we have to work across the different actors. We have to make sure that we draw in, at all these different levels, the relevant actors. We have to make sure that research, that NGOs, that private sector, that government, all are involved as is relevant for the particular context. And again, we have to work across issues and connect. The person living in a coastal community don't separate into these different actions among the SDG. It's sort of one holistic agenda, and we need to make sure that it's addressed that way. So I'll give a few examples of ongoing work that Sweden supports generally and that we from Sida also are looking at. One example is that we are, that's from the Swedish government, supporting FAO's work in the ports to stop and control illegal and unregulated fisheries. So that's just one example of a very, very important work. And that, of course, links to work on building capacities at the national and regional level. So a very new support that we've just entered into from the Swedish, from the Sida side, is support to something called PEUMP, hopeless acronyms. It's Pacific European Marine Partnership. And it's a partnership in the Pacific, obviously, and it's about working at local, national and regional level on managing fishery resources and building resilience among local communities, and doing that both across the issues and across the scale. And from the Swedish side, we have very much a focus on the most vulnerable communities and also looking at gender issues. So that's one example of a new support. We have also some old ones, like Mangroves for the Future, also in Southeast Asia, that started already after the tsunami in 2004, which is also very much about building resilience, empowering local communities, and at the same time supporting enabling framework at the national and the regional level. Other example of new support, or new support or new close for an ongoing support, is that when we renewed our collaboration with the World Conservation Union, the IUCN, they work, of course, broadly on this agenda. They work with biodiversity, they work with climate change, but we very clearly wanted sort of to elevate the work on the marine issues. So there is now a special component on working on the plastics and the litter. We are also very happy generally that the government, which is now in the process of, I think, the final tinkering almost, for a new strategy for environment, climate and marine. You know, at Sida we are guided by strategies decided by the government, and they cover bilateral work or global work. So there is a new one, or a renewed one in the making for environment, climate and marine issues. And that one will substantially be beefed up. So we might even get something around 750 million a year or more starting from next year, which means that we will be able to program lots of new activities, and are already looking at how we can beef up our support with both ongoing actors like UNDP or UNEP or regional actors, but also how we can find and work with new actors. I would also like to highlight, and I think it's particularly relevant here, that as part of supporting capacity building, we must not forget the importance of supporting national research capacity in the countries themselves. We are doing that to some extent from Sida. We are supporting national research programs in Tanzania and Mozambique, which include strong components of marine research. I don't know, how many of you here, has anybody been involved in either of those two bilateral programs? That's a bit strange. Because there are, I mean, I've been living in Tanzania, so I know there are very many Swedish persons that have been commuting a lot to Zanzibar, for example, and the marine research institution there. They have been working a lot with the local communities on protection of and sustainable management of the local fisheries, but also on how, for example, women groups can develop sustainable processing from pearls, from seaweed, and also from sustainable fisheries. So it's a good example how research, innovation, and outreach actually works together. So the two marine programs, Mozambique and Tanzania, we are also supporting a regional program called WIOMSA, Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association, which works collaboratively across from Eastern Africa and to the other side of the ocean. And I think, again, it's about supporting the research institutions themselves. It's not about us exporting agenda, but we are doing it in strong collaboration with Swedish researchers. And we've seen lots of results, as I said, I mentioned from Tanzania, while at the same time resulting in PhDs from the countries themselves, but also a lot of knowledge among Swedish researchers and institutions. We also collaborate with the private sector. Prior to the conference, we have a network together with a number of large Swedish companies called the Swedish Leadership for Sustainable Development. And together with these companies, including IKEA, H&M, and so on, there was one of these voluntary commitments to address particularly the plastic issue and the sustainable management, generally leading for the oceans. So I think that's also quite a good example of how we try to work. And finally, we also work with NGOs, international NGOs, NGOs, I mentioned IUCN, but also Swedish NGOs like Swedish World Wildlife Foundation, WWF, and Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, Naturskyddsföreningen in Swedish, for those who don't know their English name. So that's sort of how we try to sort of contribute in different ways. We have, in response to the signal from the government, but also because actually looking at the need itself, now trying how we can catalyze not just this new global strategy and leverage more support and funding there, but also work across in our bilateral programs, in our regional programs in Africa and Asia, and how we also internally can make these connections. So I'll end there, but I really look forward to continued collaboration with you on this very, very important agenda. At Sida, we need to have the inputs from your side. We need to have the science base, but we of course need also to have the outreach. So we are all in this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think we will skip the questions and come back to them after the coffee break in order for us to be able to listen to Beatrice Crona just before the break. Beatrice, please.
Jag kan trycka på home bara. Ja, där. Hoppas vi det sist. Kan jag fixa med den där? Good afternoon, everyone. I'll say that I too am, first of all, quite hoarse, but also a little bit intimidated to follow after Rashid, but also very honored to have been invited and to also have the presence of the Crown Princess. As you can see, the title is slightly different from what's in the program. I'm going to take a very 10 minutes of briefly trying to guide you through some global to local, and what I perceive as the importance of really promoting cross-scale understanding when it comes to some of the challenges that Rashid has presented. And Rashid spoke about the fair or the unfair, rather, distribution of fish around the world. And I think one of the main mechanisms behind that unfairness also is trade. So my talk is going to take a fairly explicit trade lens as another complementary approach. Because nearly 40% by volume of landed seafood is internationally traded today, according to FAO, making seafood amongst one of the most highly traded food commodities in the world. And I think, therefore, it's fair to say that trade really is increasingly driving seafood production and therefore also local marine ecosystems all around the world. And one way to understand this globalized seafood system is by examining prominent structures or actors of the global seafood market. And this has been done through some work that was actually spearheaded by Henrik, where are you? And supported by Jean-Baptiste Chouvray, who's also in the audience, and then supported by me and Carl and Max Trell from the Bayer Institute. And this graph, what we tried to do there was just identify the key actors in the global seafood system initially, which was no small task. And this graph shows the top 160 companies ranked by revenue, and really just shows the increasing consolidation we see in this sector, and which I would argue you see increasing a similar consolidation, if not more, in many other food commodity trade sectors. And we see that the top 10% here account for nearly 40% of total revenues and correspond to some 20% almost of the global total value of seafood back in 2012. But I think the importance of these actors lies not only in their ability to exert tremendous power, of course, over other actors in the value chains in which they're involved, but also the fact that they're actually linked to the largest and most commercially valuable fish stocks we have in the world. Stocks that also play a really key role in supporting human nutrition worldwide. So that was a global way of kind of looking at this seafood system. I think another way to examine the global seafood system is to instead look at how the increasingly global trade of seafood lands in local fishing communities and ask ourselves, what are the local effects of this globalized seafood market? And some work that we did a few years back attempted to try and start doing this. And we were inspired by the notion of global environmental change syndromes, if anyone's heard of that. But basically, we tried to examine the co-occurrence of social, environmental, economic, and even political outcomes related to the liberalization of the seafood trade in lots of different places, well-documented small-scale fisheries around the world. And you see them all marked here on the map. And what we came up with was essentially 3 primary syndromes of social ecological outcomes. And you see them color-coded here, with green representing sort of positive outcomes of healthy stocks, and the other 2 being associated with various aspects of decline and conflict, or decline and elite capture of wealth. And the first thing that I think is most noteworthy about this figure is that you don't see green all over the US or Europe, for example. You see green, these healthy syndromes with healthy outcomes happening all over the world, just like you see blue and yellow dots all over the world. And this means that geography is not what's driving this pattern, I would say. Instead, the factors behind this are, among other things, the types of species that are being traded and their ecology, but also the local market structures, of course. But also the existence of strong institutions, strong resource governance institutions, which one might expect. But also the end markets, so the markets where the demand comes from. And in other words, the drivers that appear to generate these syndromes worldwide originate from multiple scales, locally, nationally, globally, kind of echoing, coming back to what Maria was saying earlier. And this, to me, suggests that what we're seeing here is the emergence of what some scholars have actually referred to as teleconnected vulnerabilities, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that funny term. But teleconnectivity as a concept stems from the natural sciences, where it's been used to refer to causal connections between environmental phenomena that occur far apart. But back in 2008, I think it was, Neil Adler and some of his colleagues, they built on this notion to show how vulnerabilities of people and societies in different places can be similarly linked by environmental change, but also by socioeconomic factors like markets and trade. So I'm going to argue that I think this is exactly what we're seeing in the global seafood system today. These syndromes that I've highlighted here are an indication that these vulnerabilities can be, or the vulnerabilities that are associated with seafood trade are similar across geographies. And it means that these separate localities are actually very similarly vulnerable to change or shock. And the dynamics behind them, as I already highlighted, are driven by driving forces at multiple scales. So now I'm going to take another little step to the side and say that while this type of work, I think, is interesting for all those reasons that I just mentioned, it really shows broad system-level outcomes, so whole communities in each of these countries. But it really doesn't tell us very much, or it doesn't give us a very nuanced picture of the distributional aspects of seafood trade. To do that, we have to delve much, much deeper and to start to look at the structures and complexities of the value chains, among other things, the market structures of these small-scale fisheries. And if we do that, it opens up for a much, much richer understanding of how trade interacts with, but also affects communities. But I don't have very much time here, so I'm only going to point out to a few things that I think are interesting. And this actually builds on some work that we have done in collaboration with African colleagues and Philippine colleagues, but the African colleagues under the umbrella of WIOMSA, which Maria mentioned earlier. So here's an example from East Africa, from Kenya, in fact, where we've been examining some of the average income across nodes in these types of small-scale fisheries value chains that you just saw an example of earlier. And we see notable inequalities in these value chains amongst the different segments. And I'm just going to point out a few things that I think are interesting. Here are large-scale traders, which, if we look at them in terms of their earnings, they're earning incomes at the individual level that far dwarfs any other actors in these value chains. Another interesting thing to note is the consistently lower income of women in these value chains. And what you can do, this is just income, you can also take account of the number of people in each of these value chain segments or nodes. And if you do that, you can try to then assess the share of wealth that is captured by that whole segment in terms of the overall wealth generated by the system. And if you do that, you start to see things like this. And it's interesting because here we do see that as a group, fishers in these systems that we've been studying at least are capturing quite a significant portion of the overall wealth generated, of course, by virtue of being quite a number of them as well. But I think it's also interesting to see that the gendered effects that I mentioned earlier remain. The colors up there, you see the orangey red, 9%, those are female traders. But we see that their ability to capture a significant portion of the wealth from these systems when we move to, in this case, the rural system, is virtually diminished. And it's partly as a result of the presence of these large-scale traders here. But these guys, I will say, because they are primarily men, they also do feel a really important function here. They are what we would call like spatial brokers. They connect the rural supply with the urban or export markets. Another attempt to try and unpack similar kinds of local structures in the Philippines and in Tanzania and Zanzibar, in fact, show comparable levels of inequality. So whether we're looking at the whole fishery across these countries, or whether we're looking within segments and comparing inequality within segments, or within traders, or within fishers, we see similar kinds of patterns. And I'm glad that Rashid actually told you all how to interpret these Gini coefficient diagrams or Lorentz curves, but basically fairly high degrees of inequality here. But I think what's interesting is that when we start to look across multiple cases, we see that there appears to be, sorry, lost track here. What drives inequality when we start to look across many of these cases that we've studied is actually that what drives inequality seems to be partly what type of seafood is being traded, or more importantly, the existence of export-oriented commodities in these small-scale systems. And also where you are and the need for having spatial brokers to connect markets, because there are inherent inequalities that are associated with the introduction of the actors that can either supply to the export market or that can fill these brokering functions, because only certain types of actors are going to have the kind of know-how, the human capital or the financial capital or other types of infrastructure. And this echoes the kind of explanatory factors that I showed behind the syndromes earlier. So just summarizing a very rapid journey from the global down to the local, I'm going to argue that there are 4 reasons, I think, for the need to take a look at both and to consider both. And the global perspectives, of course, they elucidate global market structures and areas where power, but also potentially a lot of agency, is consolidated. And it basically provides us, I think, with a much needed understanding of the, you could call it the anatomy of the global seafood system. But that in itself is not going to help us tackle some of the challenges that we're faced with regarding sustainability of the seafood system, I believe. For that, we need to understand how these global structures drive outcomes at the local scale. And so therefore, we need this kind of cross-scale analysis to understand that. And then understanding the way that trade-related factors that are impacting local outcomes cut across many different scales or levels is another thing that highlights that governance has to be nimble and has to be able to adjust and experiment at multiple different scales simultaneously, again tying back to what I think Maria was trying to highlight. So for example, I would argue that measures to address poverty, we can't just rely on local things like measures to address poverty by having gear exchange programs or building local capacity. But at the same time, can we only rely on top-down initiatives? Like, for example, procurement documentation is a favorite that's right now being pushed down supply chains by a lot of retailers and their first-tier suppliers in the hope of changing things on the ground, making fisheries more sustainable. Those are all good, but we have to recognize that they're not going to work unless we see that they're landing in very different types of contexts where the ability to handle those kinds of pressures from global supply chains are going to be very different depending on context. So finally, I think only examinations, or at least recognitions of the often very complex local market structures are also going to make us aware of the distributional aspects of or impacts of trade that occur at the small or at the local scale, and which are often gendered. And because they're often gendered, they often tend to have a big impact on things like child nutrition, schooling, things that are of primary well-being importance for communities. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Again, we'll also save some of the questions for Beatrice until after the break. So this is a lot of food for your head, and there will be a lot of, well, some coffee at least, and something to eat for your stomach. But there's a little bit of music for your hearts as well, I think, here. So if you would please welcome on stage El Perro del Mar, Sara Aspring and Jakob Hage will tell you a bit about their music. So please.
Belly button, belly button. We all come from the belly button, belly button. We all come from the belly button, belly button. We all come from the same pattern, pattern. We all start from the bottom, very bottom. We all start from the very bottom, very bottom. We all start from the bottom, very bottom. We all start from the same very bottom, bottom. We all come for butter, bread and butter. We all come for bread and butter, bread and butter. We all come for butter, bread and butter. We all come for the same bread and butter, butter. They keep making us live on daydreams. They feed us a daydream when we need something real. We can't eat a daydream. We all come from the belly button, belly button. We all come from the belly button, belly button. We all come from the belly button, belly button. We all come from the same pattern, pattern. Belly button, belly button. From the belly button, belly button. From the belly button, belly button. We come from the same belly button, button. We all start from the bottom, very bottom. We all start from the very bottom, very bottom. We all start from the bottom, the very bottom. We all start from the same very bottom. We all start from butter, bread and butter. We all come for bread and butter. We all come for butter, bread and butter. We all come for the same bread and butter. They keep making us live on daydreams. They feed us a daydream when we need something real. We can't eat a daydream. They keep making us live on daydreams. They feed us a daydream when we need something real. We can't eat a daydream.
Tack.
Thank you so much.